Okay, so trauma's impact on the brain. Traumatic experiences are so overwhelming that parts of the brain go offline while others go into overdrive. And as a result, your brain fails to process the traumatic events and integrate it into the timeline of your life as it would any other experience. So the trauma never becomes part of the past and it is ever present, as evidenced by pervasive flashbacks and near constant state of fight or flight. Again, this is where we think about compassion. Trauma just doesn't go away, it's ever present, we're reliving it. Brain scans reveal that when trauma survivors experience flashbacks, their brain reacts as if the actual trauma were happening in that moment. So trauma hinders the brain from accurately and effectively perceiving threat. So trauma survivors go through life constantly jumping, even when there is no threat. And that's what's so difficult about it. You feel permanently unsafe. Now, I'm going to now look at trauma's impact on the body. Trauma and flashbacks cause intense emotions and physical sensations that are so overwhelming, the survivor copes by suppressing their emotions and physical sensations. As a result, they can become disconnected from their bodies, unable to identify and interpret their physical sensations, which makes it impossible to feel fully alive and take care of our bodies and minds and engage with other people. When you suppress or can't understand what your physical sensations are telling you, the body finds other ways to demand your attention. So many trauma survivors develop psychosomatic issues. So these when you have physical illnesses and ailments without any obvious physical cause. So a lot of you might have the following: migraines, neck pain, back pain, fibromyalgia, as I mentioned before, headaches, asthma, breathing issues, digestive issues, irritable bowel syndrome, and chronic fatigue. Okay, there's nothing wrong with you, it's normal. Trauma has a big impact on the body. And there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which talks a lot about how trauma is held in the body. And I know it's hard to read when you've got trauma, so I've done a very quick, condensed a bit of information about this book. So trauma can stem, as we know, from a one-time event or ongoing experience, from abuse to a severe car accident or wartime combat. But it can cause a lifetime of flashbacks, nightmares, isolation, insomnia, hypervigilance, and rage. Until just a few decades ago, there was no umbrella diagnosis for trauma, and patients are often wrongly diagnosed with depression, mood disorders, substance abuse, even schizophrenia. An incorrect diagnosis led to ineffective treatment and patients continued suffering. I think that bit is really important. I work with a lot of women who have different diagnoses for personality disorders or mental health conditions, very commonly depression, anxiety, and the umbrella diagnosis for trauma is missed. So they're not getting the support they need. The effects of trauma live on not only in the emotional mind and the chemical makeup and circuitry of the brain, but also in the body's physiology. Traumatic experiences rewire the brain to cause people to be hypervigilant to threats. The slightest hint of a threat sends trauma sufferers into a fight or flight response, triggering stress hormones to flood their bodies and keep them in a state of hyperarousal long after the perceived threat is gone. Over time, hypervigilance and hyperarousal cause physical ailments and hamper trauma sufferers' ability to function emotionally and socially. Now, I know I've sort of repeated myself a bit, but that's The Body Keeps the Score. If anyone's interested, it talks a lot more about the body. And it talks also, there's a lot of good stuff in there about sort of the research that's been done that can help trauma sufferers. Now, I'm not an expert on all that research, but we'll talk a little bit about self-help further on. But that book could be a useful starting place for those of you who are interested in how trauma has affected your body as well. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder and shame. If you have all the symptoms we talked about before, it's please remember these are a normal response to frightening and abusive behavior. But many women feel a lot of shame after domestic abuse, and then many women also feel ashamed of having these symptoms, as if something is wrong with them and they're not normal. It is normal to feel shame, but it is very important to try and show understanding and compassion to yourself rather than judge yourselves. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very difficult and painful condition to live with. It means you have suffered a great deal. And for many of you who have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, you've also experienced childhood abuse or other traumas. Now, you would not judge or shame another woman who'd experienced domestic abuse, so please try not to judge and shame yourself. It is normal and understandable to feel shame after domestic abuse, but this will just keep you feeling like something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You did not abuse anyone, and the abuse you experienced was not your fault. The abuser is an adult who knows the difference between right and wrong, and they chose to abuse. This is why they do it in secret and are so often charming in public. The abuser wanted to control you and make you scared and dependent on them. The abuser should carry the shame because they have done something cruel and abusive. When we replace shame with self-compassion and self-understanding, we start to heal and regain our sense of self and self-respect. Many women feel shame because they did not leave the perpetrator. It is therefore important to understand trauma bonding and why it makes it so hard to leave an abusive relationship. When we take time to understand our behavior, we can learn self-compassion and not to judge ourselves. So we're going to have a little bit about trauma bonding now. This is when a dependency is created on the very person who is abusing us. And if we're looking at trauma, I think it's really important we understand trauma bonding, because then we can let go of the shame of staying in that relationship, and because we understand why we stayed. So what is trauma bonding and why do we stay? Trauma bonding is a strong psychological connection that develops between the victim and the abuser. The abuser isolates the victim and behaves inconsistently. They can be frightening and cruel, but then they may be kind and affectionate or stop the abuse for a period of time. The victim then feels gratitude and love for the abuser and relief that the abuse has stopped. The abuser may also love bomb or ignore, making the victim grateful for any attention. The rescuer and the abuser are the very same person, which means the bond becomes deeper than other relationships as she depends on the abuser to survive. The victim also clings on to hope that the abuser will be the good person they met at the start. And women often talk about a Jekyll and Hyde split, like the famous book where you have someone with two very different personalities. The abuser then becomes both the poison and the cure. And that's a quotation from another wonderful woman I worked with who described her partner as both the poison and the cure. And I think that really summarizes trauma bonding. You know, they cause the pain, but then in some way you go back to them for the cure for the pain. And that's why we get hooked in, and it's so hard to leave. Now, some of you have been asking, can we heal from trauma? It's such a good question. I believe we can't erase what we've gone through, but we can think about converting trauma into growth experience. And this is called traumatic growth. In order to do this, it can help us think about specific coping strategies for trauma and PTSD symptoms. Positive coping actions are those that help to reduce anxiety, and we'll look at some of those, lessen other distressing reactions, and improve the situation in a way that does not harm the survivor further. These type of coping actions improve things for today and hopefully for the future. These include using natural supports if possible. Now, I know this isn't an ideal case scenario, and a lot of you might not have this. They might be talking with friends, family, support groups, co-workers at your own pace. It is helpful to follow your instincts with regard to who to talk to and how much. So I would recommend the key thing is safety. So talking with people with whom you feel safe. If you don't have any family or friends, and that's very common if you've been isolated through domestic abuse, it would be coming to someone at the Women's Trust and sharing it in support groups or with a therapist at the Women's Trust as well. Learn about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, which hopefully is what we're doing today. It is useful for survivors to learn about trauma and how it can affect you, learning how common PTSD is, and finding these problems are shared by hundreds and thousands of survivors of trauma. It can help people recognize you're not alone, weak, or crazy. You would not judge anyone else for having your symptoms, so please do not judge yourself. So talking to other trauma survivors for support, being in a group with others who've gone through similar experiences may help. It can help you reduce your sense of isolation, rebuild trust in others, and it may provide an important opportunity to contribute to the recovery of others. And that can also help your self-esteem, to know that your experiences can also be of use to others as well. Talk to a doctor about trauma. Part of taking care of oneself means mobilizing the helping the resources that are available. A doctor could take better care of your health if they know that you have post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and they can refer trauma survivors for more specialized and expert care. There's something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or TRE. Now, I'm going to stop here and say I work with a lot of women, and a lot of women say their GPs are not sympathetic. First of all, it's impossible to get an appointment. I know now more than ever. If you do not have a sympathetic doctor, I would recommend you change your doctor if you want to, only if you want to, but you have a choice. You could change your doctor. You could request a female doctor if you feel more comfortable talking to a woman. I have a female doctor for that reason. And also you could say to them, please, can I have a referral? I think I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I have all these symptoms, and I'd really like to be assessed for that. So even if your GP can't help you, maybe you could ask for a referral. Sadly, there's a huge lack of funding for people who have trauma. But EMDR are these eye movement exercises you do in front of a screen. I'm not going to go into it too much now, but you can Google it if you're interested. But your doctor could refer you. They tend to be short term, so maybe 4 or 6 sessions. So they're cheaper than long-term therapy. And I do hear really positive things about them. And then trauma release exercises are a series of exercises that help release trauma in the body. If you are interested in following these things up, please do with an experienced, qualified practitioner who understands trauma. It's so important you work with someone you feel safe with. Okay. Sadly, there's not much help out there. I've got to be honest, I've been doing this job a long time. Women don't always get the help they need from professionals, in fact, very rarely. So you can think about things you can do for yourself. These could include breathing exercises, meditation, swimming, stretching, yoga, prayer, whatever spiritually nourishes you, listening to quiet music, spending time in nature, and so on. However, really important to say that while these relaxation techniques can be helpful, they can also increase distress at times. So when you talk about meditation and breathing exercises, I would say they have to be guided and not silent. So going somewhere we have guided, mindful breathing support. If you're left on your own with your own thoughts and your own pain, meditation can actually be very frightening and overwhelming. So it's doing it with a practitioner who can guide you through and talk you through, so you have something else to focus on other than just on internally. Increasing positive distracting activities, positive recreational work or work activities, artistic endeavors, maybe voluntary work. A lot of women I work with find creativity helpful, writing things down, singing, dancing, painting, expressing. Domestic abuse is like a prison. It stops you expressing yourself. If you can find a way to express your feelings in a way that feels helpful to you, it can be very private. No one else has to see it, but at least in some way you might be honoring yourself and recognizing what you yourself have gone through. Sometimes taking prescribed medications can help, rather than using drugs or alcohol to help with trauma. That's a very individual choice and something you could talk to your GP about. Starting an exercise program, anything in moderation, can help release physical tension. Might be walking, jogging, swimming, weightlifting. I work with some women who get really into boxing. They say it helps release anger, and it also makes them feel a bit more empowered and less scared of the world. Exercise can improve self-esteem and help people feel they have some control in their lives. Volunteering in the community. It's important to feel like you have something to offer to others and you're making a contribution. After domestic abuse, your self-esteem is often so low. It it can help to realize you have something to offer the world. Um, when you're not working, you may feel you are not you could still volunteer and do something positive if you wanted to, but only if you're ready. I think all of these things, as I read through them, I want to say there's no rush, okay? And volunteering in the community might be after 2 years or 10 years. It might be something you never do. It's really important you trust your instincts and do what feels right for you. Um, Animal therapy. Some people feel they don't trust humans, but they feel safer with animals. Equine therapy, working with horses, has been shown to be very effective with people who have trauma. Um, and again, you could probably do some research about that on the internet. It might be a bit hard in London, but I do know women who have found places where they have done some animal therapy and they found it really helpful. Sadly, it can be very hard for survivors of domestic abuse to get the right support and to get trauma-informed therapy. But here's some more things you can think about to help yourself. So I know these are the basics, but I really fully believe these are the sort of fundamentals. Okay. Physical self-care. Try and eat regularly and healthily. I know when I'm hungry, I don't think so well. Yeah, I can't control my thoughts so much. I get a bit out of kilter. Try and eat regularly, try and eat healthily if you can. That's an act of self-care and self-love. Exercise we've talked about can be helpful. If you do feel sick, if you have symptoms, physical symptoms, see a doctor, look after yourself, take time off at work if you're sick, give yourself permission to rest and sleep. We've talked about dance, swimming, walk, run, play sports, sing, self-expression, wear clothes you like, try and think about your sort of hygiene, just gently looking after yourself. If you feel the strength, it might be just take a little day trip, go to a nice park, sit in nature. Psychological self-care, make time for self-reflection, writing in a journal, thinking about how you can decrease stress in your life. Try and listen to your thoughts, your beliefs, your feelings without any judgment. Let others know different aspects of you. Trauma can keep us very isolated from the world and very alone. So it might be coming to groups and learning that you can be yourself and that you're okay as you are. It might be engaging your intelligence in a new area. Domestic abuse takes so much of our energy and our identity. So it might be you start thinking about other interests for yourself. Practice receiving from others. If people want to pay you a compliment or make you a cup of tea, you deserve that, okay? You're allowed support. Staying curious about life, staying questioning. And I think that's why I love it when women come to workshops and groups, because it shows you haven't given up. You're still interested in each other in life. And that's really hopeful. Say no, start thinking about making boundaries. Now, I put this in very briefly. I'm not going to read through it because I don't think I've got time, but it's just there for you to look at, okay? Unhealthy boundaries and healthy boundaries. Emotional self-care. Spend time with others whose company you enjoy. Stay in contact with important people in your life. Give yourself affirmations and praise yourself. Find ways to increase your sense of self-esteem. Read comforting books or films that you like that comfort you. Identify comforting activities. Think about things like nurturing yourself. Yeah, how can you look after yourself? Allow yourself to cry. Allow yourself to laugh if you can. Express your outrage and your anger if you want to in a healthy way. This might be through writing or protesting or writing letters if you want to. And allowing yourself to be playful and creative. Spiritual self-care. Make time for self-reflection. Spend time with nature. Sing, dance if you want to. Be open to inspiration. Cherish your optimism and your hope. Be aware of the non-material aspects of life. I'm always really struck by women I work with will often define themselves as not successful because perhaps they haven't made money or bought a house or got a job, and yet what I see in them is such kindness. So think about the non-material qualities you have, your kindness, your compassion for others, and try and practice that to yourself. Have experience, oh dear, just went back there. Have experiences of awe. That means staying open to the beauty of life, be open to not knowing. Identify what is meaningful to you and your values and whether they have a place in your life. Now, I know that's just a list that you might think, well, that's just a list. It doesn't really mean anything. But I guess what I want to say is that self-care is where it's at, okay? When you start caring for yourself, noticing yourself, you are valuing yourself. You are undoing all the cruelty that the perpetrator did. To me, that list is the opposite to the wheel of power and control. It's you noticing yourself, taking care of your body, your spirit, your brain, your heart. It's you being kind to yourself. So I know it just might be like a bit of a boring self-care list, but these things are really important because when you do them, you say, I matter. Now, negative coping actions, can help perpetuate problems. They can reduce distress in the short term, but not in the long term. So you might want to just recognize without any judgment whether some of your coping actions that help you in the short term may be causing more permanent damage to you. This might be smoking. Don't give yourself a hard time if you smoke. I'm thinking, obviously it's not good for your health. I'm thinking more drugs and alcohol. These habits can become difficult to change. So think about what you're doing to your body. Negative coping methods can also include isolation, workaholism, violent behavior. I see that less, not in women I work with really at all, but I'm thinking more about unhealthy eating, binge eating, self-destructive behavior, self-harming. Before people with PTSD learn effective and healthy coping methods, they might try to cope with their distress in ways that lead to more problems. I work with a lot of women who I would say ignore their pain by looking after everyone else. That's probably the most common thing I'd say, sort of compulsive caretaking of others, which can become like an addiction. And Gabor Mate has a lovely quote, which is, don't ask yourself why you have an addiction, but ask yourself why you have the pain that causes the addiction. So he's always talking about focusing on the pain underneath the addiction. That's the important bit. If you work with the source of your pain and support yourself, that would help with these other coping mechanisms. Okay, I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move on. Gabor Mate wrote a book, When the Body Says No, which some of you might be interested in some of his work. He says trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. So he sees trauma as a sort of living thing that you're living with all the time as a result of things that have happened to you in the past. And these are some of his quotes that I like. Every human being has a true, genuine, authentic self, and the trauma is that disconnection from it, and the healing is the reconnection with it. I think that is so helpful because I think domestic abuse forces us to disconnect from ourselves. And we do that to survive. We have to disconnect from ourselves and our emotions, and we have to shut down and numb ourselves to survive the abuse. So in a way, when you're thinking about healing, think about reconnecting with yourself, listening to yourself, being kind to yourself, paying kind attention to yourself. He also puts another quote here, which I like. So much of what we call abnormality in this culture is actually normal responses to an abnormal culture. The abnormality does not reside in the pathology of individuals, but in the very culture that drives people into suffering and dysfunction. It might sound a bit complicated. I think what he's saying is don't shame yourself. Don't beat yourself up. We live in an imperfect world which allows cruelty to happen, cruel things happen. Yeah, we live in a world that doesn't understand trauma, where sometimes the very things that are meant to help us, like the courts, the police, can actually further traumatize us. So try and think of it like that there's nothing wrong with you. okay? There's nothing wrong with you. Don't shame yourself because you've got trauma. Maybe there's, we live in a world that allows these cruel things to happen, okay? Gabor Mate also says some other things, and I'm going to come back to what we talked about right at the beginning. We talked about trauma being a wound and multiple wounds. And he says trauma is not just a wound, it's a wound that's not healed, and it causes a defensiveness, and it causes more pain. Also, what happens to wounds is that they scar over. And if you look at a flesh wound that's scarred by the scar tissue, it's less flexible and has less feeling in it. It doesn't grow and it doesn't develop. It's a protective covering, but it doesn't have the flexibility and the vitality of real flesh. And so people who are wounded are limited and constricted in their capacity to respond to the world. And they can become separated from their own feelings and their own gut feelings, in fact. They develop a view of the world that's tinted by pain or distrust, or they lose their sense of security and they don't know who to trust. Sometimes they trust the wrong people, they don't trust the right people. So trauma has many implications and many consequences. Now, again, I know these things are a bit wordy, but I want you to think about your wounds and think about, for me, I know people want to move on and you want to move on, and there's often an impatience to move on with your life, but you have these wounds. And so trauma healing for me is about recognizing you have these wounds, understanding them, and paying them loving attention and tending to them and looking after them with self-compassion so they can heal in the right way. Yeah. So these wounds don't keep hurting you and holding you back. You might always have scars from these wounds, but you can carry on living and engaging with life. He also says being cut off from our own natural self-compassion is one of the greatest impairments we can suffer. Along with our ability to feel our own pain, go our best hopes for healing, dignity, and love. What seems non-adaptive and self-harming in the present was, in some ways, at some point in our life, an adaptation to help us endure what we then had to go through. If people are addicted to self-soothing behaviors, it's only because in their formative years they did not receive the soothing they needed. Such understanding helps delete toxic self-judgment in the past and requires responsibility for the now, and hence the need for compassionate self-inquiry. So he's saying he works a lot with addiction, and people with trauma often have addiction. And he's saying, don't judge yourself for having addiction, but bring yourself compassion. Okay, so replace toxic self-judgment with compassion. And when you do that, there's hope for healing and dignity and love. Now, I'm not saying you have to read any of his work, but I really love his writing. And if any of you are interested, he wrote that book there at the bottom, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he writes a lot about that. So how do we start practicing self-compassion? Well, it's a big subject. And there is another webinar I've done on that. But neuroscience research shows the only way we can change the way we feel is by becoming aware of our inner experiences and learning to befriend what is going on inside ourselves. Mindfulness not only makes it possible to survey our internal landscape with compassion and curiosity, but can steer us in the right direction for self-care. As I often tell my students, the two most important phrases in therapy, as in yoga, are notice that and what happens next. Once you start approaching your body with curiosity rather than fear, everything shifts. Again, this is taken from The Body Keeps the Score. And his belief is that if you take time to pause and look at your internal landscape, look at your wounds, not with judgment, not with impatience, but with compassion and curiosity and kindness and kind attention to yourself and your body. As we know, a lot of trauma is stored in the body. That's that's a really good start for practicing self-compassion. So please think about paying kind attention to yourself and your body. Now I'm going to end now with a few quotations that other people have said about trauma, which I think are quite helpful. And I think it's also important to hear what other people say about trauma, because you know you're not alone, okay? You are not alone. Other people have got post-traumatic stress disorder, and they've talked about it and learned about it. PTSD occurs following a trauma that was so awful that in retrospect, you don't understand how you survived. What that causes is an extreme feeling of vulnerability that you get past, but that doesn't go away. And so I want to say it's very normal to feel extremely vulnerable when you've got trauma, okay? And what you do when something is vulnerable, you protect it. So think about protecting yourself. Think about boundaries. You can look back on that sheet on boundaries in this webinar. Unlike simple stress, trauma changes your view of the world and yourself. It shatters your most basic assumptions about yourself and the world. So the assumptions you might have before, life is good, I'm safe, people are kind, I can trust others, and the future is likely to be good, are replaced with these feelings. The world is dangerous, I can't win, I can't trust other people, and there's no hope. And that's a really scary place to be. You can feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And so we have to think about what Gabor Mate said about reconnecting with ourselves, reconnecting with hope, reconnecting with people, reconnecting with compassion in a safe way. And then that makes the world feel tolerable again, rather than just a terrible, frightening place. And that takes time. So we always come back to patience. I like this quote: I did not ask for the things I've been through, and I certainly didn't ask my mind to paint and repaint these pictures back in flashback form. You're allowed to be angry, okay? You didn't ask for these traumas to happen to you. You didn't ask to be in this situation. You're allowed to feel angry. There's a lot of injustice in domestic abuse. There's a lot of injustice. Often the perpetrator seems just to get away with it, and you're left with this trauma, okay? You're not alone, and you're allowed to feel angry, and you're allowed to feel rage about it. But try not to take that out on yourself. Okay, I love this quote. A lot of women here would have experienced trauma when they were young, and you might have a very hurt inner child. Think about giving her love. When you love a girl that has lived trauma, when she realizes you are choosing to love her and not hurt her, she will love you back with the same kind of tenacity that it took to walk through fire. I think that's really powerful and beautiful. For those of you who have experienced hurt as a child, try and show yourself loyalty. Show yourself loyalty. Show that part of you that suffered, be loyal to it. Stand by yourself. Show up for yourself. Yeah. Think about personal power. Bad things do happen. How I respond to them defines my character and the quality of life. I can choose to sit in perpetual sadness, mobilized by the gravity of my loss, or I can choose to rise from the pain and treasure the most precious gift I have, life itself. Now, I know for some of you, I get that life might not feel like a gift right now. It might just be too painful. But I suppose what I would say is I hope you at least feel you have some choices. And you can choose to beat yourself up, or you can choose to be kind to yourself. And I would really encourage you always to choose to be kind to yourself. That's where healing starts. When you're kind to yourself, you're saying, I matter. I matter. I am important. I do deserve kindness. Please be kind to yourself. You'd be kind to someone else. You'd make a choice to be kind to someone else who'd suffered. Please make that choice for yourself. Letting go of shame. Always remember, if you've been diagnosed with PTSD, it is not a sign of weakness. Rather, it is a proof of your strength because you have survived. And that's so true. You have survived and you have great strength. And we can be vulnerable and strong all at the same time. And you can own your vulnerability and also your strength that you have survived. Think again about you making choices. Trauma creates change you didn't choose. You didn't choose to have your trauma. It happened to you. But healing is about creating change you can choose. Again, I'd encourage you to choose self-compassion always, always. That is the key place from which to start. If that's the only useful thing you get from this webinar, I'll be very happy. If you come away just being a little bit kinder to yourself. Remember, nothing is wrong with you. It isn't about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. Okay? If you think you're bad because bad things happen to you, you're not bad. Bad things happen to you and you're sad because of that. Replace I'm bad with I'm sad. I know it's simple, but it can be effective. Okay? It's not badness in you, it's sadness. Patience is the key to healing from trauma. I know some of you might not want to hear this. We all want to get on with our lives. We don't want our abuse and our traumas to define us. You cannot heal a lifetime of pain overnight. Be patient with yourself. It takes a long time to rebuild yourself. Be patient. Try and think about the journey, not the end result. You know, for me, it's a lifelong journey, healing. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong journey, but hopefully there can be some joy on that journey. If other people don't appreciate the journey you're on, if other people don't respect you, if other people don't allow you to heal, maybe it's time to think about who you have and who you don't have in your life and make choices about that. You want people in your life who support you. It can be very painful healing from domestic abuse because there's a loneliness that you have from experiencing, from being isolated. And then afterwards, you can feel very alone with your trauma. Personally, I think it's, for me, I'd rather be on my own, helping myself in a compassionate way than with the wrong people who might judge me. Okay. And I believe that if you look after yourself and value yourself, that in time you will attract the people in your life who also value you. So I know it can be a lonely journey, but stay with patience and stay with kindness to yourself and gentleness. Again, this image that I really love of this bowl, trauma shatters us. It can shatter us. Many women I work with describe themselves as feeling broken, in pieces, and shattered, and that's the sort of language they use. I know I come back to this image a lot, but I think it's very important. The gold, I think, is self-compassion, and I believe that we can, if we show ourselves self-love and self-compassion and kind, gentle attention and patience and honor ourselves, I believe we can repair ourselves with gold. And understand that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. And I love that because that is traumatic growth. And that your experiences, what you've gone through, doesn't make you less than other people. It doesn't make you less worthy. In fact, it could make you more beautiful than ever. That all your scars, all the broken pieces can actually give you great humanity and compassion and understanding and empathy for others, that you can have a renewed strength. But it takes time. It takes time. And if you imagine, you know, fixing a broken bowl, it takes time and patience. Okay. And so I'd encourage you to spend time with yourselves and with great kindness. Okay. Now, getting support, there's a little bit here. When we have been abused, we can lose our trust and faith in human nature, and it can be tempting to self-isolate as this feels safer. However, this can make life feel lonely and empty, so it's important we find safe ways of getting support and connection with people when we are ready to do so. Workshops and support groups can be a safe way of meeting other people who've had similar experiences in a confidential setting, and we offer them at Women's Trust if any of you are interested. Some women find voluntary work a good way to be with others in a safe way, and that can increase our self-esteem. And then I've repeated there, you know, yoga classes, the gym, art classes can also be a safe way to meet people, an environment where you have something to do and don't have to open up to other people. The thing about trauma is it makes the world unsafe and we isolate. But the paradox is that in order to heal from trauma, we actually have to make connections with the world as well. And that's what makes us feel connected and supported. And like we're not just sort of floating around on the outside of the world, but we're actually part of life. So it's about being safe and making safe connections, the word safe being key. Here, there is some websites and helplines might be helpful. Samaritan's phone number, offer 24 support if you feel suicidal or that you just want to talk to a human being. National DV line is there. Rape Crisis, NIA, Solace, Women and Girls Network, The Haven, Samaritans, and Rights of Women. So you can look on those websites for more practical support as well. And at the end here is the reading that the books I was referring to, and The Body Says No, book Abel Mate, also his website where he has a lot more information about trauma. The Body Keeps a Score, Also, two really brilliant books, Trauma and Recovery, and Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder from Surviving to Thriving. For any of you who are interested, you could these are quite common books you could probably get at the library, or you could buy secondhand. Or I'm a big fan of listening to things. A lot of people find it hard to concentrate and read when you have trauma, so I get that. And that's why I wanted to put in a few quotes from these books today, so you don't have to go off and read the whole thing. Because I know when you've got trauma, reading a whole book can just feel like too much. You probably haven't got the time. But there's Audible as well, where you can listen to things as you walk around, and that might help too. And I've also put some podcasts in there. If you have you can look on the internet or on a podcast app. Dharma Punks NYC is a neuroscientist and psychotherapist and Buddhist who does a lot of really, really great podcasts about trauma and how it affects the brain, for any of those, if you're interested in that. And Tara Brach, who does some really beautiful podcasts on self-compassion. I think if you don't have a kind voice internally, it can really help to listen to other people being kind. And then hopefully that will become your own internal voice. I think they're both really good. So yeah, you might want to look into them. I'm going to end this now, but thank you very much for your time today. And I will be doing more webinars. I'll be doing one next week on isolation and loneliness, and that might be something that's useful as well to come back to.